Someone asked me a question after my previous talking video. So in that video I talked about how death and dying in the Old Norse language was described in metaphors that showed how they perceived death as an encounter with the goddess, and that this encounter often was described as making love to the goddess. So this person wrote to me and said that I think it was a he, his first reaction was that life was hard and that people will make up nice stories about what to expect next. But then he had remembered a book he read about the goddess of life and death and regeneration, and that this idea fitted very well into the idea of making love when you die as a symbol of new life being created, of regeneration. And he asked me if I thought that the ancient underground temple tombs and the tradition of burying people in the ground may have been a symbol of how the dead return to the womb of the goddess to be reborn. And well, I said yes, I think that it was so. And then he asked me the tricky question: if men expected to make love to the goddess in death, what did women get? Good question. I could come up with a lot of academic theories about that, but it would not cover what I personally really think. The only thing I will say about this within the confines of academic research is that all the written sources were written down by men, and it is the curse of history that male scholars, and they were the only kind for a long time, up until quite recently, have not cared about what women experienced, simply, which is why we get so few clues. And one exception is the woman in the Icelandic saga I talked about last time, who perceived that she would be dining with the goddess Freya. At least she expected a party. But most of what we hear in Old Norse sources is the lore of male experience. Male goddess worshippers, yes, but males nevertheless. And they got more than a party. So did men get all the fun? When I was thinking about how to answer that question, the clue as to what approach I should take came when I reread his observation about how people make up nice stories about death because life was so hard. And I thought, okay, it's time to come out of the closet and tell about your own experiences with death. I had a near-death experience, and I will tell you about it because my story will serve to illustrate my point about these metaphors for dying. Because of what I experienced myself, I personally do not think that people just made up stories in the myths out of the blue. I think they based their stories heavily on real life experience, or I should say real death experience. My story first. Okay, here goes. I was 15 years old and I was out cross-country skiing in the mountains of Norway. In my company there were children who were younger than me and thus got all the attention when a storm overcame us. Before I knew it, everything around me was white with fog and snow, and I could reach out my hand in front of me and not see my hands. I could not see my own legs if I looked down. I was totally blinded and I could not hear anything except the wind whistling furiously in my ears. And as I strained my ears to hear the companions that I could no longer see, all my attention suddenly went to that whistling tune instead. It was as if that tune of the wind was calling me, and that call was irresistible. I followed. And at some point I realized that I was utterly lost, and I knew enough about the mountains to realize that this was it. No one could hear me or see me any more than I could hear or see them. The cold was creeping up on me. I was not carrying any equipment for survival. That moment I realized that I was going to die right there and then. And now I was in a state of mind that was like trance, and I was very young and more flexible, I think, you are when you're young. When I realized that I would die, I instantly accepted the fact with utter calm and lay down in the snow to wait for death to happen. I was like hypnotized, and I don't know how much time went by, but suddenly I stopped feeling the cold. The whiteness around me was suddenly replaced by a kind of white crystal light, and everything became utterly bright. And there was this sense of being welcomed back to my true home by beings who loved me. And greater than all of these beings was one who was pure light, and I perceived it as a woman. She was holding me, nurturing me, loving me, like the love of a mother, only 1,000 times stronger, because there were none of those expectations and needs that a human mother would have. It was a feeling of safety, of love, and of absolute joy and intense pleasure. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. Nothing had ever been able to compare with that feeling. And I think it was this is what they call bliss. And I was so disappointed when I suddenly felt myself being pulled away from that place, and I woke up in a dark world where someone was screaming at me and shaking me and slapping me, and I was saved, and it was a total letdown. I was actually very depressed about having to continue life after that for a while. Now, after my experience, I started to have very lucid dreams, very clear, quite mythological in a dreamlike way, and in my dreams I kept meeting the same mythological creatures over and over again. And to me, the most important figure I met in these dreams was a woman, amazingly beautiful yet transparent, and I thought of her as a goddess. She would just come to me and comfort me and guide me in my dreams, and when I woke up I always very easily figured out stuff that had been confusing me before. I felt that this lady was following me, that she was there with me, guiding me and comforting me. Well, now to work. There are 3 aspects of my story that I have realized as an adult seem to correspond with the mythical lore of my ancestors. The first aspect is the call I felt when I started listening to the wind. I felt pulled towards something. It was irresistible. And now this kind of irresistible yet dangerous call is a very common feature in myth and folklore. In English, I think you know it as the siren song, which is derived from Greek actually. But now in Norwegian folklore, people talked about the Huldresang, which means the song of Huldra, who is the queen of the underworld people who live in the forest. Now, this has been a common part of Scandinavian folklore up until quite recently. My grandfather, I remember, told me when I was a child that he had heard the Huldresang as a young man, and that it had been almost impossible not to follow it, and he had actually even seen the Huldra, he claimed. And as an adult, I asked him about it, whether it had just been a story to entertain me or whether it had been true. And he looked at me and said, it was sort of true. It wasn't exactly a song and it wasn't exactly a woman, but it was the feeling, he said. He said there are just no better words to describe what he experienced. It is the kind of experience that you have to describe in terms of metaphors, he said. And I have observed this happening to someone else. I don't have time to go into that, but I did. I know that this call happened, and there are myths all over the world about this call. In Old Norse myths, we have Ran, the goddess of the ocean, who calls sailors and awaits them with a net beneath the sea. Yeah, lots of myths and lore about this subject, and I think the reason for this is that many people have survived to tell the tale of such a call, and that what is described in terms of myth and lore actually is a way to explain something that people really do experience. And what that experience really is, I cannot say, I just know that it happens. Now, second aspect of my story, the moment of dying or just before death, and the sense of bliss and being held and loved that I experienced. I experienced that again many years later when I almost died again, this time from dehydration, and my first experience of bliss was sort of confirmed. And I know that this is not a unique experience. Lots of people have survived death to tell similar tales. It is very, very common, and the stories are amazingly similar. It's actually so common that even scientists and psychologists have started to do research on the subject. And apparently, just before shutdown, a brain will produce certain chemical reactions that creates this sense of bliss. It happens to animals that are torn apart by predators. It happens to human beings. It's like a mercy of nature granted to every animal on this earth. Yes, chemistry. That's a very plausible explanation if you are of a scientific mind and seeing it from a theoretical outside standpoint. I agree. But if you have seen it out of personal experience from the inside, it just becomes impossible to see it that way. I was raised and taught to be an atheist. My parents certainly did not believe in anything supernatural, but I came home from those mountains knowing with the whole of my being, without a shadow of doubt, that there is a soul, and that this soul goes somewhere when you die, and that somewhere is real, more real than this life. And if I had been a Christian, I would probably have thought that I had been in the company of Christ, the Madonna, and the angels, but I was not a Christian. And I was utterly confused because I had no spiritual language to describe what I now knew. But I described what had happened in terms of poetry. And luckily I wrote down that poem in my diary. So here goes, translated from Norwegian, what I wrote 20 years ago when I was 15 and did not know anything as yet about mythology or spirituality. I wrote, 1,000 souls came out to greet me. Among them was the mother of all. I was taken into the arms of the soul of the universe. Like a mother, that soul nurtured me. Like a lover, that soul held me. Like my death, that soul dissolved me, until I was that soul. I had no idea at the time that Old Norse religion and various pagan mystery cults described death using the same kind of metaphors that I was using. So the answer to the question, what did women get? My personal answer, based on my personal experience, was that women get exactly the same as the men. They just use different metaphors to describe it, because it was more easy for the majority of men, generally, to compare the experience of death with lovemaking about, when the divine awaiting on the other side was perceived as female. Okay, third and last aspect of my story, the lady who started to appear in my dreams. Well, these kind of visitations are also quite common, although you can't really prove that they happen in terms of chemistry, but people do have these experiences and have always had them. They're not just stories, they are the stuff of dreams and altered consciousness and may or may not be real. Depends on your worldview, basically. They have been called spirits, guardian angels, and fairies. The Old Norse called them fylgjur, which means followers. The Old Norse believed that every individual was followed through life by a fylgja, a personal fate goddess who spins your fate. And she's an aspect of the original fate goddess, but she's also an individual. And now the Old Norse also believed that most people have fylgjur who are sleeping, the daughters of coma. Meaning that your fate is unconsciously spinning away and you have no control of your own life. But they thought that if you had the courage to go into the underworld and wake up your fylgja, she would come back with you, and being awake, she would guide you and protect you, and your fate would be blessed and divine. Now, when I discovered this lore many years later, many years after I had my mountain trip, it was pretty clear to me that these people were not just imagining things out of the blue. They were putting words to real experiences that are mysterious. And I do not know what is the absolute reality behind such experiences, but I know that such experiences do happen to people, and that they keep happening to people, and that's simply the way we are put together. And people will always find ways of describing these experiences in ways that best fit into their particular worldview. And all these descriptions are different, yet the same.